Good morning, it is filled to the brim, and it is Friday, July 14th, and we're talking about loving God's laugh and how God made us to laugh too. We've talked about how God laughs in certain circumstances and how actually when we talk about God's laughing, it's an anthropomorphism, which is basically theologians tell us how we understand God. Scripture gives human characteristics so that we understand this divine being that we get to have relationship with. So God's laughter and a lot of the other things about God extending his hand and his eyes upon the people, those types of things, is really called an anthropomorphism, which is using human characteristics to understand God. My prayer, though, for you this week is that you would be filled with laughter again. Job 8:21, he will once again fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. He would once again fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouts of joy. You know, even as I'm just sitting here right now reading that scripture, the Lord's reminding me of how children laugh very easily. You know, the first session in Tuesday when I was talking about this, how babies begin to laugh at the third month, between the third and the fourth month, very early in their lives. That's how important it is to the Lord. Before they actually eat solid food, they're laughing because it's so important for their physical and emotional, mental, spiritual well-being. And I talked about, when does God laugh? Well, he laughs because he has always had victory over the enemy, and he laughs at the enemy. He actually mocks the enemy in his laughter. He also laughs because he enjoys his children. And I talked about that yesterday. Did you know God enjoys you? He enjoys you. He made you for his enjoyment. He loves hanging out with you, even when we have to be disciplined. I talked about that yesterday. I'm going to start there because sometimes in our seasons of discipline or our times of discipline, we lose our joy when that should never be the case. Psalms 30 verse 5 says this, for his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. We can know that even in the midst of our sorrows, and sometimes those have to do with times of discipline, not always, but sometimes, that his favor is constantly present. You know, it's interesting because this scripture in Psalms 30 verse 5, it reveals the interaction between God's smile and our smile. So he talks about, yes, he gets angry when sin is in our life because it's destructive. It's poisonous. It's kind of like when a parent gets angry at a child for running out in front of a car. That's an appropriate response. Why? Because you love them so much, you hate to see them getting harmed, especially if you've told them again and again and again and again not to run out in front of cars. And so you're angry for a moment, but it has to do with your favor, your desire for them, your passion for them, your protection over them, your unconditional love for them. So in this scripture, it talks about God's favor, and that we in response, sometimes a kid, he weeps, maybe you grab him, you're giving him a little talking to, and he may weep, but there is joy knowing there's protection. There's joy knowing that you have a parent there that's going to shield you from harm. See, favor with God arises even in times of discipline. It's always present, even though there is sometimes a very strong hand against us, and we need to receive that. We may respond to his discipline with weeping, but don't leave it in a weeping zone, because this scripture says, but joy comes in the morning. The joy is to emerge from our lives because he favors us. He brings joy to our lives. I talked about what Paul says in Hebrews chapter 12, talking about how a father disciplines his son, and doesn't feel good for the time, but it produces a harvest. It produces good things in our lives. See, the Lord wants to turn our mourning into joy. Now, I want to kind of go into this a little bit more extensively because I just talked about the discipline of God that can make us feel grievous or mourn. But that's another thing versus when we actually experience some really painful deaths or things in our lives here on earth. And the Lord wants to take that mourning and turn it into joy. We're going to go deep in this. Psalms 30 verse 11. You have turned my mourning into joyful dancing. You have taken away my clothes of mourning and clothed me with joy. Now, there are seasons when we have mourning, and it's rightfully so. Actually, mourning is part of the process of healing. It's part of being a healthy individual. It's significant to our healing process in grief. Ecclesiastes 3:4 says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Actually, and I've mentioned this in other things that I've spoken on Fill to the Brim, that we have an entire book on lamenting, mourning. Jeremiah writes this book and he laments the fall of Jerusalem. But see, Lamentations, the place of lamenting, is not the dwelling place. We move through it. Even though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I will go through it. I don't pitch a tent there, but I do go through those times. See, even in Jeremiah's book, in Lamentations, in his expression of mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem, he turns to the goodness of God and the faithfulness of God. One of my favorite scriptures, and I've even sung the song, if you know the worship song that has to do this, when I had been going through some tough times, this was a verse, a scripture of hope. Lamentations 3:22 and 23. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Oh, don't you love that? His mercies never come to an end. Right in the middle of my pain, right in the middle of my grief, right in the middle of my loss. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I love the scripture because this scripture brings hope right in the midst of a painful circumstance that Jeremiah is experiencing. And he, being a man that was holy, did not contribute to this destruction, did not want this destruction, but the destruction happened as a result of other situations, of other people's disobedience, and he was affected by it. But even so, he recognizes the love of God, the presence of God, his mercies, that he is new, that he has new things, that he is faithful. See, Jeremiah does not say go into the pit of depression and leave it there and stay there, but rather even in the midst of journeying through your time of mourning, and there's times of death in our lives, in the midst of it, he says the words of hope that the steadfast love of God is there and never ceases, and his mercies are there, and there's newness every morning because God is faithful. I want to give you that word. I want to give you that word in the midst of your mourning. Some of us have those times, and we do have those times. That's part of life. Another place that we are able to laugh is when we have victory as a result of battles, especially battles that have gone on a long time. And our laughter is actually a testimony of God's goodness. It reminds me of the story of Sarah. Remember her? The woman who had to wait 25 years to have a baby. And finally, in Genesis chapter 21, verse 6, it tells us that Sarah laughed. And Sarah said, God has made me to laugh so that all that will hear will laugh with me. In other words, have you ever had God do something so incredible in your life that it's almost ridiculous? Like it's not logical. And in this sense, it wasn't logical. So you laugh. You say, wow, it's overwhelming. It's supernatural. It is wondrous. It's wondrous. It goes beyond human understanding. And Sarah is in that dynamic. So she laughs in response to the wondrousness of God, and yet to the faithfulness of God, to the fulfilled promise of God, to the victory that God is giving to her in her life. Verse 6 also says in a different version, says this: God has made laughter for me. That's how it's described. God has made laughter for me. As a result of this victory, I have laughter. In another version, it says, God has brought me laughter. In the fulfilled promise, in the victory, God has brought me laughter. And she names Isaac Laughter. That's what his name means. Victory, fulfillment of promise. And I am totally confident in Scripture as we read it that Isaac was a joy to her. And also remembrance of what God had done, what God had fulfilled, what God had said to her as she looked at him, as she was awestruck by God's ability, God doing exceedingly abundantly more than she could ask or imagine, because she came to the place where she thought, you know what, this ain't gonna happen. And yet God was able to do exceedingly abundantly more. And her response to that victory was a response of rejoicing, a response of praising God. Psalms 30:11. You have turned my mourning into joyful dancing. You have taken away my clothes of mourning and clothed me with joy. She was clothed with joy. Let me stop here for a minute and say this, because I've noticed this in Christians' lives. You go from problem to problem rather than victory to victory. So you hear the problem, but you don't hear the testimony of God's provision, God's interaction, God's intervention. I want us to be people who go from victory to victory. That will increase the laughter in our lives. Do you hear me? When we focus in on the testimony of what God has done, the victory that God has done, rather than shifting to the next need, to the next request, to the next problem, looking for the next problem for God to solve for us, rather than being people of thanksgiving, people who testify, and not just testify once, one and done, but you keep testifying about what God has done and the victory that he has given. I'm going to tell you that is going to increase in your life joy and laughter. You have turned my mourning into joyful dancing. I like that because dancing is external. It has an external expression. Isaiah 51:11 says this: And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Last thing I'm going to say. If you want to combat sorrow and sighing, if you want to combat that, then walk in gladness and joy. And the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Start rejoicing in the Lord. Start thanking him for what he has done. Don't go from problem to problem. Go from victory to victory. And guess what? Sorrow and sighing will flee away. And you're going to have gladness upon you. In the presence of the Lord is fullness of joy. And that means laughter too. God bless you. Pray about this word.